All right, welcome to the first video in a series about graduate school in wildlife and conservation biology. I finished my master's in 2018 and I'm now 3 years plus into my PhD at Clemson University. And the reason I'm making this series is looking back, I realized I didn't really know what I was doing before I started graduate school. And I've learned along the way and had some help from a couple mentors here and there. But there's a lot to applying to graduate school and it can be really confusing. And so this series of videos is designed to sort of give you a heads up or kind of help guide along the process for those of you interested in graduate school. So this, like I said, this is the first video in the series. This one will be a kind of a brief overview of broad graduate school, things to consider when you're just starting out and really don't know a whole lot. Following videos will be about when to go to graduate school and maybe even whether you should go, and also considering a master's or a PhD. The next video will be a little bit longer one probably. It'll be different factors to consider when applying to graduate school. So things like who your advisor might be, what's the project, do you have funding or not, and how you're getting that funding, choosing your research topic, etc. So that will be a nice video with lots of factors to think about. And then lastly, the last video I'll make is I'll talk kind of in detail about my story into graduate school and even how I decided to continue on and do a PhD. Kind of get some insight there into my story. And you already know what time it is. Like I'd like to ask in my videos, leave a comment below. And just hit me with any other questions about graduate school that I haven't covered in this video. So let's get started. The first thing I think is important to understand about graduate school probably applies pretty broadly, even outside of our field of wildlife and conservation biology. And that is, I really think at the highest level, when thinking about graduate school, or at the top level, there's really two types of programs. On one hand are these what I call professional programs. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these throughout this series. I don't have personal experience with them, and they're a little bit less common than research programs, which I'll get into. So these professional programs are typically shorter. They're typically 1 to 2 years, and they're, I guess, always probably a master's, and typically a non-research based master's. And these programs, I think, are generally designed for people who are continuing to work and want their master's. You've heard of that in any field. Someone did an MBA, but still working full-time or part-time as well during that. And these sorts of programs are, I think, even becoming more increasingly common in our field. They're common for example, government employees. If they want to raise or be qualified for a higher paying position, they'll keep working, but then get a master's. Clemson University, for example, has a master's online, completely online. This is a professional master's, and it's really only class-based. So that's one of the other major differences, that really what you have to do is classes and maybe a kind of a final report sometimes. It probably varies depending on the program. But there's lots of options out there for these professional programs, and I think maybe it can be a great option for some people who don't necessarily want to go down the research route and are looking for a boost to their professional career. Now, on the other hand, are these research-based programs, and most of the series that, like I said, I'll talk through this because that's been my experience, and I think, like I said, they're also more common. So as it implies, research-based programs are, you do research. If you're doing a master's, you're working on a thesis. If you're doing a doctorate, you're working on a dissertation, and that is a kind of a core part of your responsibility in order to get your degree, is you need to complete the research that you have promised that you would do. Typically, you have funding for that research, but not always. And we'll get to that. We'll get to funding in another video. But so that's the main difference, is you have this research responsibility, but you also, in master's and a PhD, you're also taking a research base, you're also taking classes. So that's part of it. That's part of your responsibility as well. And I think another major difference between professional and research based is that since you're doing the research, as far as I know, always have an advisor. So that means you have a professor that you're assigned under, and you're doing research under them, and they have to agree to take you on into their research group. And with a professional master's, like I said, you're not doing research, so you wouldn't necessarily need a research advisor, which makes sense. Okay, now the next step, which I hear students talk about a lot, is if you kind of know that difference and you really want to get into a research program, and let's just say you want to get a master's in wildlife biology or something like that, doing research. All right, so the common question, or the next question is, well, how do I get in? And one important thing about our field, wildlife and conservation, is that, as far as I know, if you want to do a research, if you want to get a degree, you need to have an advisor who agrees to take you on. And so this means that you're not necessarily applying to a program like you would for an MBA or even these professional-based masters. You're applying to an advisor, and they have to agree to take you on, and then you get accepted. Then you apply to the program, and typically always accepted if that advisor really wants you to join the lab group. One is sort of an organic process where you kind of network and make connections with them. That might mean you meet them at a conference, you get to talking, you have similar research interests, you probably scope them out ahead of time, and you talk with them and say, hey, I'm finishing my degree, or I've been working for a couple years, and I really like what your group is doing, and these are my interests, and I think we're well aligned. And maybe they say, hey, that sounds like a great fit, send me an email and we'll talk more. And kind of the other organic way, which has been probably more common in these times of COVID, where we haven't had in-person conferences really, is sending them an email. So maybe you do your research online, and you find an advisor or a professor that's doing some really cool work that you're interested in. Send them an email. So what's important is that first impressions really matter in both the in-person at a conference context and in this email. So in this email and in this in-person, if you're meeting them for the first time, you really want to show them that you've done your research. You want to show them that you understand the kind of research that their lab group does, why it's important, and how your interests and experience align with what their lab group is doing. Why you'd be a good fit, essentially. Obviously in that first email, you want to avoid typos, etc. Make sure it's a perfect email. Okay, so that's the first way to find an advisor. And maybe I should have mentioned this, but pretty much to find people that you're interested in, there's a couple ways to do that as well. Like I say, Google people. If you have an undergraduate advisor, even graduate students that you're connected with in your department, or if you ask them, they often have larger networks and know people that are doing similar work that you might be interested in. Okay, so that's the first way, is kind of this organic way, either through email or networking in person, something like that. The other way is to get into a program is to find a project that's already funded. And this is how I got into my PhD. And a funded position essentially means that advisor, or if you ever hear the term PI, that stands for principal investigator, that's a top level advisor person who would be your advisor. They have secured funding from a funding source. Maybe it's National Science Foundation, maybe it's a state agency, maybe it's from a university through a grant or something like that. They have funding, and often that funding is tied to a specific project. And so they'll post that project online, for example, on Texas A&M, where you see some graduate projects, or on Twitter or whatever, and you apply to that project. So you say, hey, this looks cool. In some ways, your kind of research questions are, the skeleton's already there because they have the funding, they have an idea of what they want to do, and you apply to that program. It's almost like applying to a job. That PI is going to look through those applicants and narrow it down, do some interviews, and hopefully you're selected. So those are the kind of two ways to get into a program, find an advisor, again, organically through email, without necessarily a project necessarily in mind, but working on one together. maybe they have one in the pipeline. Number two is finding these funded positions, which is pretty common as well. And so that's it for this video. This is, like I said, just an introduction to the graduate school. We'll have a few more videos coming up down the pipeline. Like I said, leave me a comment if there's anything else that I didn't talk about yet. Feel free to leave it in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer. Peace.